Kia ora, hello, welcome. First, I'm recording this in Hobart, so I'd like to acknowledge the Muanina and Palawa peoples, the traditional owners and custodians of the land here upon which my university campuses are built, and pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging. I'm Dr. Hanne Nielsen from the University of Tasmania. Today I'm presenting a project that Gabriella Roldan, based at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and I are working on. Collectively, we have over 20 years of Antarctic guiding experience, and we think that this is an area that deserves closer scholarly attention. So we'd like to look at how policy decisions about Antarctica are enacted on the ground in Antarctica by those Antarctic tourism guides. Now, as polar guides, we're constantly negotiating between policy and practice, between tourists and the Antarctic environment. So in this talk today, we'll provide a little bit of background to that industry, what's going on with that contemporary situation, and then talk a bit about the role of the Antarctic guide, which is what we focus on in this project. Once we have that baseline understanding, we can look at connecting policy and practice in terms of those next steps. And what that can do is help ensure the decisions made at the highest levels of Antarctic governance are enacted each day upon the ice itself in an effective and safe way. Now, when we talk about Antarctic tourism, most of that is concentrated in the Antarctic Peninsula area. There are some voyages to the Ross Sea. There are some continent-based tourism as well, so inland camps or visits to the South Pole. But 98% of that is cruise-based and in that peninsula region. So that's by far the most common Antarctic tourism experience that we would see. Antarctic tourism is not something new. In fact, we're going back to 1957, 1958. We had the Argentine Navy taking 2 voyages down. The sort of tourism that we know, the expedition style on those vessels with smaller boats that go ashore, that sort of awareness of conservation and the environment as well, that expedition cruising sort of has its roots in 1966, an Antarctic Peninsula voyage that was with Lindblad, Lars-Erik Lindblad. And that tourism, as that started in the 1960s, that's sort of developed to what we have today. That also really disrupted some of Antarctica's unspoken rules too. For instance, bringing women to Antarctica and visiting some of those bases, arguing they're run by public servants and should welcome fellow citizens and things. If we fast forward to today, what are we looking at? Well, we've got these historical statistics of recorded seaborne tourism. This is something that the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, or IATO, collects at the end of every season. So a graph showing that growth from 1992 through to 2018-19 with that dip around the global financial crisis as well. We've got an orange total number of seaborne tourism, which includes passengers on cruise ships with landings and cruise only, and the yachts. So we can see that has been going up. A few of those figures there. This was sort of 2018-19, looking at 55,000. And of course, going forward from here, what this map will look like is sort of in question what the graph will look like because of the impacts of COVID-19, which we'll come to a bit later. But in terms of some of the challenges in that situation at the moment, well, Stewart et al. Have noted that the changing tourism demand is a key research priority in the polar tourism sphere. We see things like the growth of the tourism industry. We've got many new ships in production, for instance. We've got a diversification of the industry as well, many different activities being offered, not just cruising, diving, hiking, kayaking, even submarines available on some expedition experiences. We've got questions around the locations of activities, that question of cumulative impact too. This is an area where there is existing research looking at this in particular, that human footprint. We've got questions about staffing for Antarctic voyages too, and on the legal side, things like liability. So a lot of the existing research looks at things like experiences of tourists, environmental impacts, or industry trends from a policy perspective. What's missing is what is going on with those people who deliver the project. And so guides are mediating between visitors and the Antarctic environment. They are the ones who ensure the environmental and safety guidelines are adhered to on the ground. They play a really important role. And there is, of course, interest in these tourism activities at the highest levels. We've got the Environment Protocol and Tourism Guidelines attached to recommendations from 1994. We've got IATO coming to the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings and tabling papers each year about the state of the industry, making sort of recommendations of what should be happening going forward as well. But the guides are the ones who are delivering that. They're providing the background information to guests in the form of lectures. They're leading interpretive hikes on shore. They're directing tourist gazers when on small boat cruises. And this has been observed by Thomas in 1994. But there's very little on the actual active role of the guide being published since then. So what we want to know are, who are these guides? What are their backgrounds? What's their professional practice? What's their perception of the role? We don't have a benchmark of that. And that's really important because they have this mediatory function there. And we need to understand current practices in order to plan for sustainable growth of that industry. So there are a number of IATO guidelines of conduct for Antarctica tour operators. This is often how those guides would come into contact with that policy, but some of those things that are happening in the far south are so telling companies to hire Zodiac drivers who are familiar with driving in polar regions, having 75% of the staff with previous Antarctic experience, those ratios of passengers to qualified lecturers and guides, and having mandatory briefings before going ashore for both guests and for staff members as well. What does that look like when they come into contact with this? Well, there is an IATO test for people who are working with IATO member companies. So going through all of those different rules at that time, including updates and say if there are crevasses in a new location. But on board, it might look something like this. Having posters in areas where you're about to go out in one of the boats, for instance, to do with the cetacean watching guidelines, or looking at site guidelines before doing a landing to sort of familiarise yourself with what to expect there in terms of wildlife, in terms of historic sites, in terms of if you are in proximity to any ASPAs or ASMAs and areas that you can go and can't go as well. But there aren't necessarily those references back to the, for instance, ATCM guidelines, or where these sort of rules and guidelines have come from. That sort of breadcrumb trail can get lost. And we have that simplified language too, which can be useful if you're in a hurry going out to run a cruise, for instance, watching whales. But there can be some issues there which we want to investigate further by talking to some of those guides. What is their understanding of how these policies are made and what's working effectively from their perspective as a practitioner in that polar region? So how are those guidelines implemented? Tour operators have different techniques for ensuring that clients maintain the recommended distance from wildlife to avoid disturbance, whether that's cones, signs, flags, people stationed different areas. What's worth remembering is that this is a dynamic environment. We're looking at wildlife. Wildlife moves. So we do also have sort of instances of self-policing where tourists who have been briefed are sort of having to also remember what is that distance to stay from the wildlife and sort of remind each other too, as well as what those guides are doing on shore. And the guides, of course, the ones setting out those cones or marking out those areas. We do have questions here too about that Antarctic experience and idea of wilderness, and whether those cones, flags, signs, or those foreign objects interrupt that Antarctic experience at all. And this is another thing that we've been looking at. What is it that these guides think that they're delivering? What is that Antarctic product? What this looks like in practice too, putting these guidelines into effect. A really good example is the boot scrubbing between different sites. It's this performance aspect involved here as well. That boot cleaning, very much a purity ritual, so scrubbing of those with biocide before coming down to Antarctica between different landings. It is linked back to the Madrid Protocol, so not wanting to introduce pests and species, and to that mandatory briefing that all guests and staff have. But we also interestingly see pictures of this particular ritual up on social media as well. And in many other cases, those guidelines, if they're working well, are not actually noticeable at all at those landings. So back to those people who are doing the scrubbing. We do have a need for really skilled staff in that area, particularly given that there are more ships, there are more diverse activities happening. So in response to that, we've seen some companies training staff, for instance, an academy approach. We've also seen accreditation schemes popping up. One example, the Polar Tourism Guides Association, which is private, but had this idea that there should be a standardization of different qualifications across the industry. So we've got questions of who trains these people, who should, what do you need to know to operate effectively and safely in the far south? And these on-the-ground tourism practices really deserve closer attention. That's useful for industry, for understanding the makeup of frontline staff, And academically, it fills a gap too, because we know a lot about guides generally, but not in Antarctica. And given the unique geopolitical situation and complex international and environmental management regimes, that's really important. So we've done a pilot project. We've interviewed 24 Antarctic guides. We wanted to get the perspectives of those polar professionals that have hitherto been overlooked, looking at what is the background of that guide, how have they come to that job, what does a typical day look like, how do guides access information and make sure that's up to date, very pertinent at a SCAR conference. What do they see as their relationship to Antarctica, or their responsibility for mediating between policy and the environment, and what do they see as future challenges? And we were doing these interviews in April 2020, so we do have some perspectives there on the impacts of COVID-19 on Antarctic tourism, as well as asking those people what would they have said at the beginning of the season, so 2 strands there. Those demographics, we've got a bit of a breakdown from gender, career level and region. So we did have quite a good spread. Some people who'd done only 1 or 2 seasons, so early, some who had been going up to 5, mid, and a number who had been in this for even over 30 years in some instances, and from many different areas that they were drawn from. We're still analysing this data. We have a lot there to look at, but in terms of some of those recurrent themes, what was coming through, in many of these conversations, guides were saying that more training and specialisation was needed, different ideas about how that might look or who should deliver that. There was concern about the growth of that tourism industry, people being aware of their carbon footprint too, so guides concerned about their travel to get to Antarctica, thinking how do I make the most of my job down here to make sure I'm being a good ambassador, for instance. Guest expectations can be difficult to meet. That can have implications for safety as well. And then in terms of entry into the workforce, there was a lot of mention of word of mouth. But there was also a number of stories to do with sexism in that industry too, which is something we think needs to be looked at further, particularly given that Antarctica is a workplace. And similarly with this idea of having really long days at work and sometimes no breaks in between different activities. So that's something that deserves closer attention. And why work as a guide? Many different responses, but a lot coming through to do with adventure, a love for Antarctica for this place, and that this is the only way to get back there. And also that it's a really cool job. So in terms of next steps, we've taken a bit of a sidestep too with COVID, of course, impacting the industry quite a lot with those uncertainties, ships that are half built, travel zones between countries and within countries, many questions over the coming seasons of Antarctic tourism. So we're first analysing responses from the guides to do with what they see as the future in light of COVID. That's feeding into a SCAR project on the impacts of COVID-19 on Antarctica. But we think in the bigger picture, it's really useful to have an understanding of who these people are, what they're doing, and how this practice relates to high-level policy in order to effectively streamline that process from policy through to practice. So what do the guides know? Where are the gaps? How can industry be brought up to best practice across the board? And we need to know that for the sustainable future of the industry and to know what sort of support's needed going forward. So as we continue to analyse our really quite comprehensive data set, we look forward to assessing that current professional practice in the Antarctic against best practice elsewhere in terms of guiding, establishing a baseline for that industry, and to making constructive suggestions to support sustainable and safe tourism activity in the Antarctic for all of those involved, but particularly for those polar professionals who really are on the front line.